if the sermon gets too long, you can begin to pray for a strong wind. I'm telling you, by the end of service, it's going to be great. So the truth about life is that we see different realities. Is the glass, is it half full or is it half empty? And once you decide, how do you know that your perspective is correct? It's like if you've ever seen those Gestalt kind of trick pictures. You glimpse at it and it's an old lady, and you look again and suddenly it's a young woman. They're both in there. And once you see one view and then you see the other view, can you then see them both at the same time? Can you ever unsee it? The point is that we do see different realities. And usually what we see is the result of what we've been trained to see. But who or what is doing the training? That's the question. Who or what has trained your perspective of the world? Jesus had an audacious method of training people in the world. He would bring opposites together, literally bringing enemies together, zealots with tax collectors. He would hang out with sinners who everyone would want to stay away from, the impure, the unclean, the poorest, and the lowest. And the Apostle Paul went on to emulate this methodology. He brought together Jews and Gentiles, male and female, rich and poor, tearing down the segregated social norms so that each could see the value of the other. Early Christianity was revolutionary, not because it brought the masses together, not because it brought opposites together to overthrow Roman Empire, but opposites were brought together to love and care for each other, to enhance the well-being and health of each other, to live the example of Jesus' teaching. Do to others what you would have them do for you. And that was the revolution. That was the empowerment. That was the weapon through which the world would truly change. The means would create the ends. It's much easier to use violence. And for most people, the way they see the world is it's much more practical. That's what this text, I think, is all about. Say to this mountain, in other words, in the face of the utterly impossible, climate change, endless war, domination, Roman Empire, disease, death, poverty, racism, militarism, sexism, in the face of the impossible, one must be trained to see in every situation the possibility of something new. And by seeing the new, one is empowered to choose faith, trust, over fear. It's like that Gestalt picture, perceiving what you cannot at first glimpse see. And then seeing how both and is more expansive, and it offers more options than either or. Both the old lady and the young woman, both half empty and half full, and even something more. But there are mountains of difficulties that make such a way of life, such a way of perceiving life, almost impossible to live. In Christianity, we have often referred to these mountains of difficulty as our cross or sin. And I've always been struck by Paul's definition of sin in Romans. Whatever is not from faith is sin. It's pretty simple. Whatever is not from faith is sin. In other words, whatever separates us from each other, whatever causes us to see the old lady without the young woman, or the half-empty glass without the half-full glass. Faith is seeing God as all in all. Sin is segregation, the separating of the part from the whole, as if the part doesn't really belong. Jesus' core message that he role modeled with his whole life was do unto others what you would have them do unto you. In other words, embrace. Don't separate. See in the other yourself. Bring good news to the poor. Sight to the blind. Set free the imprisoned. Liberate the oppressed. Practice jubilee. Cancel debts. Forgive them. Redistribute wealth so that it can become commonwealth. No more aristocracies. No more generational poverty. And rest. Give Sabbath rest. Stop all the producing and consuming with weekly rituals of rest for all creatures and creation itself. That's the core. That's the core of Jesus' message. That's the core of Christian faith, Christian perception, a Christ-like attitude, a guide to action. Christ empowered the world to see reality differently, which is why I think to this day the whole world honors Christ. All other religions honor Christ. There's always this deference, this respect. Jesus is a hero for so many, an ally for all. But following Christ, becoming Christ-like, that seems to be almost an impossible way to live. The door to Christ is gigantically wide, but few squeeze into it. This, of course, has been the historical difficulty of Christianity. As a spirituality, as an ideal of love, Christianity is enormously attractive and freeing. The whole world honors Christ. It has the power to take a despairing, drunken, druggy loser like me and offer new ways of seeing and being in the world. But as a religion, Christianity has often fallen into the segregation, separation trap. As a religion, Christianity has often been antichrist, inverting the message and mission and meaning of Jesus into its opposite. When you look at that glass, spirituality is your perception of it. Half full, half empty, both. Religion is what teaches you how to perceive. Religion is the rituals and the messages that form the habits and attitudes that you carry into the world. And on the one hand, religion is incurably tribal. It will inevitably create in-group and out-group, sinner and saint, pure and impure dualisms. It's just built into the cake. But within that tribalism, most religions also create a path for the outsider to become an insider, or at least a friend. I love the Jewish Seder ritual that keeps an open chair at the table for the arrival of Elijah, the prophet, the stranger who is welcomed. I love the Methodist ritual of Eucharist. It's not true in all of the denominations, but for Methodists, we have an open table where everyone is welcome with no litmus test whatsoever. But even our Methodist ritual of openness is tribal because our table is open. Why? Because our religious doctrine says that the Eucharist is a converting ordinance, which means that we hope that the ritual itself makes them and us. It's not bad, but it is tribal, as if us is the pinnacle of existence. Religion is incurably, inevitably tribal. But religion, at its best, points towards a larger universalism, a holistic ideal, something new, something more. What we admire in Jesus and what continues to empower us is the spirituality of Jesus that dissolves who's in and who's out, who's a sinner and who's a saint, who's pure and who's impure. Jesus universalized his Jewish tribal religious roots. And Paul continued this same spirituality. And the best of our church, our mystics, Martin Luther King, Desmond Tutu, Dorothy Day, all the peacemakers and justice seekers, they keep pointing to this gigantic door of inclusion, even to the point where people like myself are welcomed, warts and all, welcomed with that kind of Mr. Rogers type welcome, and then loved into a new reality. Long ago, my glass had a busted hole in its bottom, but today it overflows. That was my religion. It was the best of the church. It taught me how to drink. Now, today, the best of the church is increasingly difficult to find. Something has happened to Christianity that has turned it into an anti-Christianity. This isn't the first or the only time it's ever happened. After all, the church as a religion has done horrible and demonic things over and over again in its history. Slavery and segregation was justified by the Christian religion, as was the genocide of the indigenous of this land. I've never known a war that didn't have a sacred canopy of the church justifying that God is on our side. The gruesome crusades were made into holy pilgrimages for Christ. And on and on. Everything Jesus held as the center of his spirituality, the good news to the poor, compassion for the other, setting free the imprisoned, liberating the oppressed, proclaiming Jubilee, all of these core principles have easily and often been abandoned by the religion of Christianity as it loses sight of love and instead practices and worships power, being on top. The great mountain of temptation for religion is to create spiritualities of exclusion and condemnation and segregation as it builds a world predicated on us versus them, we righteous and those sinners. But the core, the absolute foundational core of Jesus is to love your enemy, which is impossible. It's impossible. You know, Sharon Sherrard is always talking about confession. We need confession. I mean, and she's right. We should confess every week. We have no clue as to how to live out the full meaning of the spirituality of Jesus. We're attracted to it, but we don't know how to do it. But even Jesus' death was for the sake of reconciling opposites, peace between enemies, forgiveness, mercy. The weapons of Jesus were invitations to lay down your weapons. Think about that. Your tongue, your thoughts, your attitudes, your perceptions, not to mention physical weapons. Lay them down. Live that vulnerably. Indeed, one of the reasons that so many folks wear crosses as jewelry is to signify that there shall be no more crucifixions. It's a signal that I, the wearer, am not a crucifier. But over and over, the religion of Christianity has turned that cross upside down, making it into a sword, a weapon that deludes its user into thinking that love can actually emerge from fear and compulsion. Thankfully, historically, over and over and over again, the spirit of love raises up the contradiction, the witness, that reveals the limits, the hypocrisy, and the cruelty of loveless religion. The spirituality of Jesus inspires and empowers us, but the religion about Jesus way too often enslaves us, turning us into destroyers and distorters, or as Scott Peck once said, people of the lie. Now, over the next several weeks, through the course of the summer, we'll be talking about the latest outbreak of loveless Christianity that absolutely, if you will, threatens the integrity of the church. It's a global phenomenon. It's not just in the U.S. It has several forms. If you want to do some homework and look it up for yourself, study what's happening in Ethiopia. A civil war tearing people apart, and at its core and foundation is Christianity. It's in the political ideologies of fellow Christians, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Orbán in Hungary, Putin in Russia, and certainly here in the States. Lately, almost every day, you guys as well, we can find an article in the mainstream media about it. People are talking about this. It's often been named as the Christian right or Christian nationalism or Christian fascism. It was certainly front and center in the January 6th failed coup, and it's believed to be a major influencer of recent Supreme Court decisions, even as it is associated with the core and center of the Republican Party, its ideology, its base, so to speak. On a more personal level, it's what's disrupting so many of our extended families and friendships with neighbors. It's why we can't talk to each other anymore, why we dread seeing certain folks. It's why we're so bewildered with each other. And it comes back to this glass half full or half empty analogy. We're living in an epistemological crisis. A big word. I used it because I went to seminary. There's an amen. It's the crisis of perception. The reality that we simply are not seeing a common reality. There's a confession. We do not see a common reality anymore, and we can't assume that we do. There is, as a people, there is no longer a common sense. How do you live that way as a people? For example, this is a silly example maybe, but I still remember my shock several years ago when Kathy and I went to visit family in Arizona. And there was no recycling. There was no composting. What the heck? You know? And similarly, the night of Trump's election, I was absolutely numb with disbelief. And about a month later, when I began to realize how overwhelming white Christians' support of Trump was, how can this be? How is this possible? And continuing today, digging even deeper, I continue to discover, to my embarrassment, how intertwined white supremacy has been throughout American Christianity. It's just histories I was ignorant of. It's what I told you about a few weeks ago, just discovering, well, duh, I'm from the South. Of course my family were slave owners. But how did that stay hidden in my life for so long? But there are other histories that I've always just passed over. I'm knowledgeable, but I pass over them because I'm not one of those. I wasn't that. And what is being shaken and vigorously shaken, endlessly shaken in our culture is the shattering of what we took to be reality, common sense. The normal way of life has come apart, and we find ourselves adrift. And when you are adrift in that kind of crisis, you will seek a strong man to fix it. And Christianity today has become possessed as a religion by a strong man spirituality. It inverts the teachings and example of Jesus, those things I talked about in the beginning, into an antichrist who promises empowerment through domination, exclusion, dualism of who's in and who's out, who's worthy and who's not. What we're seeing is the rise of this nostalgic yearning for a Middle Ages type reestablishment of a total Christian culture that manages and regulates life under a hierarchical structure where everyone has a place of submission to a higher authority. And Christianity has aligned itself with Mammon and Mars, assuming that money and militarism will stop the shaking and will put Christians on top, ordering and controlling the lives of others. And those who deviate, the deviants, those who deviate from such order will be outcast and scapegoated as threats to security and prosperity. Now, the ethics of Jesus, the perceptional way of seeing reality taught by Jesus, is being rejected by those who bear his name. The invitation to that gigantic open door is seen as too expansive, too chaotic, too threatening, too unmanageable, too undesirable. Zealots and tax collectors don't belong together. Adulterous women should be stoned to death for the common good of family values. Occupying Roman soldiers ought not to be helped with healing ministries. The lepers and the homeless and the mentally ill ought not be allowed into polite society. All this talk of enemy love and putting away your sword and forgiveness and reconciliation and compassion, this is much too wimpy for what needs to be done today. The spirituality of Jesus is not useful for those who create power systems of hierarchical domination. That's what we're up against today. In-house, as Christians talking to Christians, and there are political implications. The religion about Jesus wants nothing to do with the spirituality of Jesus. But here's what religion always forgets: that God's spirit of love, opposites together, is always the contradiction to the violence of power. And that's why Jesus is always telling us, don't be afraid. Faith, trusting that opposites belong together, is the empowerment that we need to say to the 7 mountains of Christian perversion, be lifted up and thrown into the sea. Faith gives us the power to live a deviant life to that which religious righteousness imposes. We are God's contradiction because we have no enemies. How do we live if we have no enemies? After church, for those interested, we'll talk about the handout that I sent out, but I also have copies here, of the 7 mountains doctrine, which is foundational for what we are hearing and seeing take place right before our eyes. The questions that we'll be looking at are, what are the practices of prophetic loving in a time when the name of Jesus has become a name to fear? And how do we practice a lifestyle of no enemies? Impossible. But how do we practice it in such a time as this?